接下来是我们今天的第三位分享嘉宾 Adam Petway，他所分享的内容是运动表现的现场评估、比赛评估运动素质的应用。Adam 是运动科学生物力学博士，曾就职于阿肯色大学篮球队体能主管、NBA 费城76人队的首席生物力学专家和体能教练，华盛顿奇才队的运动表现总监，目前担任宾夕法尼亚州希切斯特大学的跳远教练和田径队助理教练，在各教练协会和研讨会中担任演讲人，并著有诸多关于篮球运动负荷监控的文章。那么下面开始 Adam 的录播讲座。
Good afternoon. My name is Adam Petway, and today I'm going to talk about In-Situ evaluations for sport performance using the competitions as assessment. So I pretty much worked at every level in sports, and early in my career, I was kind of on this quest to, create a standardized and repeatable test for neuromuscular assessment. And, it really led me down a lot of rabbit holes, which ended up being my PhD thesis. We looked at seasonal variations in game activity profiles and players' neuromuscular performance in conference and non-conference basketball in the Division I NCAA. So essentially what we found is early in our competitive season in the months of November and December, neuromuscular outputs and performance using a force platform and analysis were very, very different and distinct when comparing them later in the season to the months of January, February, and March. So we dichotomized the two. We looked at non-conference performance early in the year and then conference performance later in the competitive season. And our non-conference was 12 matches, right? 8 at home, 4 away for an average of 1.5 per 7 days. Whereas our conference play was 19 matches, 10 at home, 9 away, and 2 matches per week. So you look at the accumulative volume later in the season, there was more matches. There was also more density because we were playing 2 per week opposed to 1.5. So when assessing neuromuscular performance from non-conference to conference, we looked at reactive strength index, or the ratio of flight time to contact time, jump height, peak ground reaction forces, and mean contact time. So we did a 3-jump repeat test on our force platform, hands on hips, where the athletes were instructed to jump as high and as fast as possible. And what we found when running an independent sample t-test is that jump height and peak force were significantly affected and decreased later in the season when aggregating non-conference to conference play. So again, jump height had a significant decrease, whereas peak force had a trend towards significant decrease when comparing early in the year to later in the year. Of note, these jump height and peak force were absolute metrics, where the temporal metrics of contact time and reactive strength index, when aggregating as a whole, were fairly stable. So this led us to look at more acute metrics from a neuromuscular standpoint. We looked at match day -1 RSI, or reactive strength index, and in-game peak speed. So we tested the same test, both pre and post practice, hands on hips, repeat jump test. Athletes were instructed to jump as high and fast as possible, but we did it both before and after every single practice. And we looked at jump height, peak force, contact time, and RSI before practice, 15-minute window, and then 15 minutes post practice. So an athlete would come in, we would assess on our force platform. They would go through a bout of training from a technical standpoint, and then we would reassess to look at the effect size pre versus post. We also tracked all our training load and match play demands as far as total distance, peak speed, acceleration load, and deceleration load. So we tracked 17 home games looking at neuromuscular performance, match day -1 pre and post, and also all of our game demands the next day. So again, tracking neuromuscular performance, we looked at the effect size pre versus post training. We looked at that match day -1, or 24 hours prior to competition. And what we were looking at was reactive strength index and jump height. And what we found when we ran a median split analysis, looking at fast versus slow performances in game relative to the athlete's peak speed, is that when reactive strength index increased or had an effect size pre versus post practice relative to the individual athlete's norms, the next day, that athlete was going to run faster in competition, right? So you look at acute neuromuscular facilitations. If they increase the day before a game, the next day in competition, the athlete was going to run faster during the competition. So match day -1 or 1 day before the game, reactive strength goes up. So does in-game peak speed uniformly relative to the athlete's individual norm. So when assessing all this, right, like I went down, some pretty deep rabbit holes, and we were looking to find a standardized and repeatable neuromuscular assessment in a controlled environment. So right here you'll see is an Olympic triple jumper jump on a forced platform, 18-inch depth jump, looking at flight to contact time, jump height, very standardized and repeatable neuromuscular assessment. However, this athlete in his natural environment is going to express forces and velocities that are way greater than what we're assessing in a controlled environment. So this goes back to the old adages of a caged tiger versus a wild tiger. So if all you're assessing is a tiger in captivity and you throw a mistake at the zoo, they're going to function completely different than if you evaluate them in situ, right, in their natural habitat, right? So the forces right here that our triple jumper is going to produce, he's producing, up to 3,000 newtons of force. His reactive strength index was over 3 when looking at jump height to contact time. Really good ratios, right? However, when looking at the forces produced in his competition at triple jump, there's been biomechanical assessments that say he's producing up to 10 to 12 times body weight, moving at 10.2 meters per second. So when we're looking at our assessment versus what the athlete's doing in competition, it just didn't really add up, right? So I had a chance to work with a 2-time Olympic sprinter, just working on things. That's really when it kind of hit me, is like, okay, instead of using force platform analysis and Tendo units and bar speed as a surrogate menu item to assess like neuromuscular function, maybe I should use the competitions, right? What this athlete's doing out on the track to guide and dictate, what we're looking at on the force platform analysis, or what we're doing from a weight room standpoint, right? So kind of reverse engineering the sport and letting the sport dictate the general physical preparation and not the other way around, right? So this is just Wallace doing a block start here, just looking, again, projection angle set up in the blocks, flight to contact time, distance upon ground contact, all of that great stuff that you look for. And I really started looking at assessment. What's the, knee flexion angle of the front knee? What's the projection angles out of the block? What's the knee flexion angle at max vertical proportion? So all of these great metrics that we're looking at, in a cyclical sport like track and field, it's easy to do, right? Because your outcome measure is just time or distance or jump height or jump distance. So it's much easier to do this in sports like swimming and track and field and weightlifting, where the variability within the competition is very low. However, I work in basketball, right? So I wanted to understand what characteristics of training and match play look like relative to the 94 by 50 foot parameter that our athletes compete in, right? So looking at the dimensions of the court, you have, 2 10-foot baskets, a ball you have to shoot through the baskets. You have 4 teammates, 5 opponents, 3 officials. So there's human error in the officiating. So there's a lot of variables to consider outside of just, a fixed distance relative to time within that fixed distance, right? So huge variability. However, I still wanted to assess what our athletes did in competition and reverse engineer that to try to help dictate what my training menu items were. So basketball is a game of constant motion. Acceleration, deceleration, and jumping are principal components to any successful basketball player. Here we have one of the best offensive players in the world in James Harden. When looking at our lit review, athletes are going to accelerate and have high thresholds, accelerations above 2 meters per second squared, anywhere between 18 to 22 times. Deceleration is going to be slightly lower depending on the athlete and the level of competition, but you're looking at anywhere between 18 and 20 high threshold decelerations. And then as far as jumping, an athlete's going to jump 45 times during competition. So again, high volumes of accels, decels, and jumping is really important in the sporting activity of basketball. Durations of movement are also important, right? So you look at in most people's opinion, one of the best to ever do it, or maybe the best to ever do it, and Michael Jordan. Again, he's going to acceleration, distance. There's degrees of variance. You're probably looking at 2 to 2.2 miles in acceleration distance in the cumulative. Duration at high speed is going to also have a high variability. Player-to-player contact, right? So like isometric contractions and the ability to resist an opposing force in the body mass of an opponent is often under quantified as it relates to training load within the sporting activity of basketball. However, has some of the highest physiological demands. So something we'll get into later. And then jumping. Yeah, you're going to jump 45 times per competition. Again, how you jump and land and the strategies you use to do this, really important in the game of basketball. So again, looking at accels, decels, and change of direction. Steph Curry here, again, acceleration, high threshold, you're going to do it 18 to 22 times. Change of directions. This is any kind of cuttings or, maneuvers to throw your opponent off guard. And jumping, you're going to jump 45 times. So again, when assessing the sporting activity of basketball, there's distinct characteristics from physical profiles among the game's top performers. So we wanted to look at training load and match play demands relative to competition level. So we did a systematic review of the literature, and we wanted to analyze all of these physical demands that our athletes go through and see if there was distinct physical profiles on the elite level compared to sub-elite and youth populations. And what we found was that the elite athletes, somewhat paradoxical in nature, actually cover less distance in competition. So when you look at elite versus sub-elite and youth, your elite level athletes are going to actually have less total distance in competition relative to their peers. And this is true even in the best league in the world, the National Basketball Association, when looking at offensive to defensive average speeds, right? All-star versus non-all-star. So the best players in the league versus, just your average players in the league. Actually, non-all-stars on offense had higher average speeds on offense and defense compared to the all-star group. So this means, relative to minutes played, that again, your all-star players are moving at an average, a less of an average speed than their non-all-star counterparts. Peak speed, right? So elite peak speed in the NBA looking at around 8 meters per second, whereas like the average top speed in the sub-elite Spanish population was around 6.2 meters per second. So again, moving less, but having the capability or capacity to move at a faster rate. And then when compared to elite versus sub-elite positional demands, backcourt versus front court, or your guards versus your post, the frequency of running exposures in your elite backcourt and front court were significantly higher than the sub-elite running exposures in backcourt and front court. So again, distance at high speed is going to be greater in your elite athletes. However, your total distance will be greater in your sub-elite populations, right? So again, peak speed in elite basketball, they have the capacity to move very, very fast. However, they're very economical relative to the tactical aspects of the game. So they just move less. And here we have LeBron just beating somebody in transition. However, having coached against LeBron and watched him several times, he does not move in ways that are not efficient, right? So, he just knows when to strike, and when, the ball is away from him, he just kind of stands in the corner. So less total distance, but knows when to strike and generate greater peak speeds while doing so. So this led us down, that was just the physical demands in a review. So we wanted to look at tactical aspects and the mechanics behind that, right? So this is our book, The Basketball Mechanics. I wrote it along with my co-author, is an NBA tactical coach, Ryan Richmond. And, we started kicking around ideas. Is like, okay, we did our review. We know that our top athletes are going to move less, but move faster. In tactical situations, what does that look like? Like, what do the best movers in the world look like compared to not so good movers, right? So we started kicking around some ideas and started kicking around some methodologies for how we would quantify success within movement. And this is what we came up with: Basketball Mechanics. Great book. So we use Synergy Sports to identify the top 10 performers on offense in these situations. So pick and roll man, ball handler, post up, transition, off ball screens, dribble handoffs, isolations, and cuts, right? So all of these are tactical situations. Synergy Sports ranks them top 10 in points per possession, right? So if I'm in transition, right, and I have a transition opportunity and I score at a higher rate than all of my peers, and I'm in the top 10, we took clips from each athlete within that tactical situation and identified, some common denominators and characteristics within that, right? So again, transition ranks top 10. We pulled 100 clips of each athlete and just started to make a biomechanical model of these offensive tactical situations based on points per possession. Defensive situations, so flip it: rim protection, guard pick and roll, big pick and roll, post ups, isolations, and dribble handoffs. If you were the best in the world at these situations in the top 10, it was the least amount of points per possession. So you're in a rim protection situation, you block a shot, right? That's like a plus for you because the opponent did not score. So it's the least amount of points per possession for our defensive group that defines success. Then we wanted to look at anthropometrics, right? So when we identified top 10, we made a database. The NBA Combine takes height, weight, wingspan, and standing reach of every athlete that comes through there since 2001. So we aggregated all of this into a standardized thing and looked at the NBA average relative to the group average on offense and defense. So our first tactical situation was transition offense, right? We wanted to look at how athletes moved with and without the basketball relative to their peers in that top 10. And what we found is actually athletes with the basketball move at a higher velocity than athletes without. So looking at mean velocity, we saw that when we modeled out all of our biomechanical assessments within Dartfish, that athletes with the basketball on average are moving at 6 meters per second. Their acceleration, or mass times velocity, or the net change of velocity and acceleration, is 3.8 meters per second squared. We also modeled out horizontal ground reaction force. So just taking the athlete's body mass and then multiplying it times acceleration. So F equals MA. So we looked at the rate of change of velocity horizontally relative to the athlete's body mass and just modeled out what the mean horizontal ground reaction force was on their third step in transition. And then we looked at projection angles, right? So how is the athlete projecting with the basketball, and had a more steep projection angle on their first step compared to athletes without the basketball. So again, somewhat paradoxical in nature that athletes are faster with the ball in competition than without. But when examining the game tactically, it makes sense because, you get an outlet pass or a rebound, you're dictating tempo with the basketball. If you're without the basketball, you're usually spacing or getting into some sort of tactical set. So again, lower velocity, right? Lower mean acceleration and horizontal ground reaction force, and a steeper projection angle on the first step. So they're a little more upright when they run without the basketball, and they're a little more acute and a little bit lower when they run with the basketball. So again, looking at transition, what we found was just athletes are faster with the ball, and athletes have lower projection angles and higher velocities with the ball as well. So now looking at dribble handoff, right? So an offensive tactical situation where the athlete dribbles, hands it off to create space on the perimeter. So what we did is we used the dimensions of the court to model out two things: trunk lane. So just what was the angle of the athlete leaning as he accepts the ball coming around a dribble handoff, and then based on that lean and that angular velocity, right, or that circular motion, we wanted to look at centripetal acceleration, right? And centripetal acceleration is just acceleration or the net change of velocity relative to the circular motion, right? So we use the fixed point of just like the middle of the free throw line. And then in our biomechanical software, we can measure the distance from that and the distance at which the athlete was moving in a circular motion. So again, same thing, but instead of measuring straight line acceleration, we're measuring circular acceleration. And what we found is the centripetal acceleration is 3.8 meters per second squared, with a mean radius, or the point from the fixed center of the circle, of 3.57 meters. So again, creating space, there's an optimal trunk lean, and there's an optimal acceleration from a circular standpoint to come in and accept. These athletes aren't completely upright when they accept the basketball on a dribble handoff, and the athletes aren't super hunched over, leaning too far forward. So again, when talking about curvilinear speed development, this could have implications on how you apply this in your general physical preparation. The next was post up, right? So we delineated two classes of post ups. One was face up and one was back down. Face up is mean catch and I face the basket. Back down was I catch and my shoulders are back to the basket and I'm trying to back down. And this was a distinct characteristics between both, because we looked at the base angle, or the angle as you see the feet make relative to the center of mass. So the wider the further apart the feet are, the wider the angle. The closer the feet are, the more upright the center of mass will be, and the more acute the angle will be. And we also measured the distance on the catch. So when the athlete catches the ball, what's the distance from the rim relative to the distance at score? So when they catch the ball, how many dribbles do they take and how close do they get to the rim, right? So as you can see here, on a face up, you're at 42 degrees, you're 3.13 meters away from the basket, and then you only dribble 1.6 times to get roughly a meter distance, right? So again, you're further away from the basket and you're more upright, opposed to, again, you're going to be wider and lower when you're in a back down situation. You're going to catch the ball closer to the rim, and you're also going to probably dribble a little bit more. You get a field dribble, 2 dribbles. Now, this is also, I think, has a lot of technical implications as well, because you really don't have to dribble all that much during post entries, right? Like, on the ball screen situations or isolation situations in offense, you might dribble just to kind of get a feel for it. But once you catch, you have to go, right? If you take an extra dribble, let's say you take 3 or 4 dribbles, help side defense can collapse and it's probably going to be a turnover. So again, having technical implications here. When you catch on a post entry, you just got to go, right? So again, creating maybe some dialogue between performance, technical, and tactical. This is definitely something of note here. All right, pick and roll versus pick and pop, right? So again, we modeled out the base angle of a pick and roll man. So when they set the screen, do they roll to the basket? Or when they set the screen, do they kind of space and pop out to the perimeter, right? And what we found was, just based on collisional forces, that the pick and roll man was going to have a wider base angle, right, to create more stability within the system to roll towards the basket, right? So greater degrees of knee and hip flexion and a wider stance, just to create stability. This is opposed to pick and pop, right? narrower stance, more of an upright trunk and knee and hip flexion angle. And they usually wanted to avoid contact to what we would call slipping a screen so they can space to the perimeter for an open shot, right? So when you look at body types of a pick and roll man, they're usually big, brawny, trying to get to the rim and basket. Pick and pop is usually taller, a little more slender, a little more upright, and really good shooters. So think of like a pick and pop guy being like your Dirk Nowitzki types, very slender, very upright, very good shooter on the perimeter, where you know, some of your pick and rolls are like your big body guys, your Charles Barkley's, your Shaquille O'Neal's, your guys that want to like create space just through their pure mass and brute strength. Next was pick and roll ball handlers, right? So we looked at projection angles and horizontal velocities coming out of preparation, separation, and attack. So there was a distinct sequence in pick and roll ball handlers and an undulation of the center of mass as they set up pick and rolls. We delineated the pick and roll group ball handlers into two classifications or categories. The first category being if they attack the rim, right? So if you use the ball screen to go and attack the rim for a layup or shot at the rim, well, that was one category. The second one was if you attack the perimeter. And this, again, delineating kind of like we did in our pick and roll big situation or pick and roll guard. If you use that screen to space on the perimeter for an open shot, that was one category. And what we found was very distinct movement patterns between the two, right? So when looking at pick and roll rim attack versus perimeter attack, there was an undulation in the center of mass of both, meaning there was a preparation where they would rise, a separation where they would lower their center of mass to utilize the ball screen, in an attack where they would rise their center of mass again to create horizontal velocities. The thing is that when attacking the rim versus attacking the perimeter, the rim group, so if you're attacking the rim, your center of mass was much lower. And then on your attack angle, it was much lower, but produced greater horizontal velocities. So again, much like our transition group, the lower your center of mass is, and the more rise you can get on that projection, it preserves horizontal velocities to project your center of mass towards the rim, right? Whereas if you were on the perimeter and trying to use your ball screen to space the perimeter, you had more of an upright trunk, right? So like, again, there was an undulation in the center of mass where you preparation, rise up, separation, dip down, and attack. But your attack angle was much more upright and you're much more lateral, so going side to side. And again, this makes sense because you're trying to evade defenders to get an open shot on the perimeter. Cuts. So just cutting is just spacing without the ball, and it's not using a screen, and it's not using a dribble handoff, and it's not in isolation, right? So you don't have the ball, but you're using different maneuvers and kind of change of directions and cutting to create space on the perimeter offensively. So we kind of delineated the group into two, above and below the break. And the break is just the point on the perimeter where you have a corner three. On the side of each corner is a corner 3-point shot. The break is just above or below that breaking line where it starts to curve up on the 3-point line. So we delineated that above and below the break. And what we found was cuts above the break are above that point of the free throw line where it breaks off from a corner three, had more of an acute, right, angle. So, or excuse me, more of an obtuse angle. So it was a larger cut. Like you can kind of see the guy with the ball, that cut angle, right, is going to be more obtuse or larger. Whereas below the break, it was more of a confined space, right? So you had to have way more of a acute attack angle as far as your cut. And again, there's somewhat degrees of variance within cuts to cuts, but that's just how we looked at it. Above the break, you had more space to operate in, so you could have a bigger cut angle. However, below the break, you had to maneuver in a confined space, so it was more of an acute angle on the cut. Two mechanical things we noticed consistently throughout the cut group is being actively dorsiflexed on your penultimate step, or the step before the cut, when executing the maneuver, creates enough braking horizontal forces to redistribute your center of mass in certain directions. The second thing is trunk flexion and rotation towards the angle of projection, right? So meaning if I'm cutting at a 45-degree angle, right, then my center of mass or my trunk has to project at a 45 and rotate at a 45, right? So flexion and rotation towards the projection angle of the cut, right? So if you were laterally flexed and rotating away, you probably weren't going to project at enough velocity horizontally to execute the cut. If you're extended, right, you probably weren't going to create enough horizontal ground reaction force, right, to get low and project to like out position yourself relative to your defender. So again, when talking to your technical coaches, this could have profound effects on just change of direction and cutting tasks. So again, in your general physical preparation, you have to look at, okay, what angles are we cutting? What's our interest velocity and what's our exit velocity upon these cuts? Isolation, huge variance in manufacturing offense from athlete to athlete. So we just wanted to just acknowledge what this looked like and just respect the nuances. So there weren't really any mechanical consistencies within this outside of the fact, like, we noticed that every athlete within themselves had trends in how they manufactured offense. However, when you aggregated it as a group, there was too much variance to really model out one thing. So again, isolation offense is a great way. If you have a super talented athlete that can be good in isolation situations, you just kind of let them go and expect those or respect those kind of subtle nuances between athlete to athlete. Off-ball screens. So one thing we also did along with anthropometric measures is looked at performance metrics within the NBA Combine, right? And all of this is publicly available data, right? So it's not like we're giving away any kind of super secret stuff here. You could just go to NBA.com and look it up. But they assess lane agility time, shuttle run, three-quarter court sprint, counter movement jump, max vertical jump or approach jump, and then a bench press. So we looked at the aggregate of all athletes that have ever done those tests relative to the average of the group, right? And when we looked at off-ball screen situations offensively, right? Again, the ability to manufacture offense, not cutting, you're cutting, but there's a screener involved, right? So there's another player trying to create space by like screening the defender. So you're kind of utilizing your teammate, where in cuts, like, you're not. And what we found was that relative to their peers, the off-ball screen group outperformed in lane agility or change of direction task in the shuttle run, which is essentially a series of accels, decels, shuffles, and back pedals. So again, the ability to operate and maneuver in confined spaces, this group outperformed their peers in that task. So as you can see, if you look at the average of the group relative to the average of the NBA, the off-ball screen group is going to have significantly lower times in both the lane agility and in the shuttle run. Isolation defense. So on offense, we talked a lot about the ability to create space. On defense, it's the ability to occupy space, right? So essentially, offense, we want to create space to get an open shot for our best player. On defense, we want to occupy space to force a low percentage contested shot from hopefully somebody that's not a good shooter, right? So in isolation, and my co-author came up with these coaching nomenclatures. And, I'm not sure how this will translate in Chinese, but essentially it's a square. You want to square up the ball handler, right? Good defensive stance, be shoulder square to the ball. We want to contain, right? Make sure we contain them. They can't go north and south. They can't go east and west. You have them in a confined area, and then contest, right? So if they hesitate and pull back, we want to have our squared and our contain and an ability to where we can contest a low percentage shot, right? Long contested twos, worst shot in basketball, according to the analytics. If you can force a long contested two in non-shooter, that is a good defensive series. And doing that in isolation, again, individual nuances relative to certain stance angles, the ability to contain and contest, but these were the three sequences that were consistent among the group. Pick and roll bigs, right? So I'm a big guarding a ball screen situation. How would I do that? First, I want to push, right? So we measured out the lateral ground reaction forces from that push step to redirect the ball handler. We want to square, again, you see the square our shoulders relative to the ball handler's shoulders, and then contain, right? So that ball handler is coming out of the ball screen. If you remember, it's called preparation, separation, and attack, right? They're trying to either attack the rim or attack the perimeter. So we want to push them to square them off and contain them for a low percentage contested shot, right? Don't let them get to the rim north-south. If they're forcing east-west for a perimeter shot, you're still squared enough to contain and contest that shot, right? So we measured the horizontal ground reaction force and found that our guards in those situations, in that push step, when we're translating our center of mass laterally in the frontal plane, is actually going to be a little bit greater in that push step than our bigs. So for our guards, it's a little bit different because you're on ball. And then obviously there's tactical components, whether you want to like ice it or down it or force the ball screen to the sideline. If you want to go over on a shooter, if you want to go under on a non-shooter, but consistently, this is what we saw. We saw a stance, and we modeled out what a good base stance for our guard would look like. We had a push step, again, measuring lateral ground reaction forces. And then we had a pursue, right? So you're fighting over the ball screen or under the ball screen to reroute the ball handler, not letting them get north-south, but you want to pursue them enough to where if they do redirect to the perimeter, you can contest the shot, right? So stance, push, pursue. We modeled out what the optimal stance angles were as far as knee flexion and trunk flexion angles. We modeled out what the lateral ground reaction forces were in our top 10 performers when looking at these videos. And then we modeled out just what the pursuit looked like. What did it look like to stay attached to either prevent north and south movement at the rim or east and west to prevent an uncontested shot at the perimeter. Off ball screens defensively. So again, what we found here is just looking at this was body mass. So weight relative to the NBA average was significantly lower, actually 26 pounds lower, or a little bit over 10 kilos lower than the NBA average, right? So when looking at this, you want to look at talent identification and what that looks like when putting people in off-ball screen situations defensively. So if you're getting screened, you have to have enough ability to accelerate your mass in certain directions to maneuver around the screens to, again, be in good position to redirect the ball handler and force a low percentage contested shot. So again, if you have some of your heavier athletes on the perimeter trying to fight through and run around screens, probably not a good tactical situation defensively. So again, about 26 pounds or a little bit over 10 kilos off-ball group relative to the NBA average. Length, rim protection. So length is a principal component to protecting the rim. Not the most novel of concepts, but if you look at wingspan, right? So just, making a T with our arms and just going fingertip to fingertip, and then standing reach vertically, like standing on the ground. How high can you reach up? Rim protectors, like just looking at length, had significantly greater standing reach and wingspan relative to the average of the NBA. So this is, again, somewhat self-evident in nature, like put your taller athletes around the rim to protect it. But here in basketball mechanics, you have a model to go to, like how tall are the best. And again, you may want to identify some talent within your country and within your league to say, okay, if you're a certain age and a certain height, maybe could recruit you to play basketball because more than likely you're going to be a better rim protector. The other component was jump strategy at the rim, right? So you have to have length, but also you have to displace your center of mass vertically to create more length, right? You just can't stand there with your hands up for the most part, right? So we looked at jump strategy at the rim. So, you could jump off of 1 foot, you can jump off of 2 foot feet. You could use more of a hip dominant strategy where your hips are the primary fulcrum or axis of rotation, and there's a posterior weight shift, and you create more impulse and more time to generate vertical velocities. Or you could create more of a knee dominant strategy where your knee flexors and extensors are going to be more at play, and it's going to be more of a shallow strategy to increase like reactive strength or rate of force development, so spending less time on the ground, less range of motion, but trying to get up quick. And what we found was a knee dominant 2 foot strategy with both hands fully extended at the apex of the jump was the most consistent jump strategy throughout the rim protection. So if you're really tall and you're teaching jump techniques to your rim protectors, there is just if you need to generate large impulses and ground contact times to increase vertical displacement of center of mass, more of a hip dominant, big arm swing, wind up, use your hip extensors there, might be the best strategy if you have the time. However, in real time, you want more of a knee dominant strategy, shallow, real stiff, springy, quick off the ground, right? Because that's going to occupy more space and less time, right? So from what we know, like you'll get more jump height out of a hip dominant strategy, but it'll take you more time to do so. So again, there's a temporal component there as it relates to rim protection. Dribble handoffs defensively. So again, on offense, we saw the proper entrance angle and centripetal acceleration as it relates to receiving a dribble handoff. When guarding a dribble handoff, we came up with the nomenclature of body, chase, and recover. So when setting up a dribble handoff, the person handing it off kind of dribbles towards the athlete about to receive the DHO or dribble handoff. So we said we needed to get into their body to redirect that centripetal acceleration, right? So if you can increase the radius and the angle at which the athlete has to travel, they will create less centripetal acceleration, but it'll also be a less direct path to receive it, right? So get into the body to redirect that centripetal acceleration path. Once they receive the dribble handoffs, you have to chase them to make sure they don't get north and south too quickly, and you could try to force them east and west, right? Or laterally. And then recover, right? So you have to get in front of them to recover and just essentially contest what is hopefully a low percentage shot for that athlete. So body, redirect that centripetal acceleration path, chase, right? So once they received it, chase them over, make sure they don't get north and south, and then recover. Recover to force a long contested two, hopefully, from a low percentage shooter. Post-ups. Base, body, recover, right? So mass was a principal component here, but also just being low and creating leverage during the collisional forces in a post-up defensive situation. So we wanted a base, right? So why base? Getting like shoulder to shoulder with the athlete to create leverage so they can't back you down. Remember, from our post-up offense model, they had a wider base, they were lower, and they were closer to the rim, right? So you want to create a base to resist that opposing force, right? To like kind of push them out further away from the rim, right? In an optimal offensive situation on the post, your dribbles force you closer to the rim. In an optimal defensive situation in the post, you want to force them out and keep pushing out. Body. So get into their body. When they pick up their dribble, like you want to get into their body immediately. Again, you don't want them coming closer to the rim, right? You want to push them further and further away. And then contest, right? Low percentage contested shot, hopefully from a long two, is the goal of any defensive sequence tactically. So conclusion of this, and kind of took you down the journey as far as, okay, neuromuscular standardized repeatable assessment. I spent 10 years of my career just learning everything I could about that. But then I started to realize, well, maybe there's more to it. My experience in track and field kind of led me down a rabbit hole and a path that I tried to apply this in-situ model to the sporting activity of basketball. I think this could really be a great way to assess and make your athletes better relative to their competition, help transference of training, and it's a great way to increase communication pipelines and interdisciplinary models, technical, tactical, performance, medical. And if anybody has any further questions for me, this is my email. Also at ultimateathletes.com, you can order the book, Basketball Mechanics is on sale. And yeah, if there's any follow-up questions that anybody has in the group, feel free to email me directly and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. I really appreciate your time and effort today. And hopefully, if you work with basketball, hopefully you learned a lot about the mechanics behind the best basketball athletes in the world. And if you don't, maybe start thinking, okay, I work with, tennis, or I work with, soccer, or I work with volleyball. How can I apply this model to my sport to make my athletes better? And that's the name of the game. So I appreciate everybody's time and effort and concentration. And if anybody has any follow-up questions for me, please just let me know. Thanks again.
各位老师，上午的讲座结束了。如果关于 Adam 的讲座，是否有想要问的问题？尹老师在吗？这边有一位。
我来补充一下吧，把这个信息再跟大家交流一下。因为像这个 Adam 的这个书呢，其实我是读过一章之前啊，那也是非常感兴趣。但是后来呢，也是由于时间的关系，这个也确实是没有把它完整读完，所以呢，对他的书中的介绍的内容呢是，思路呢也是大致的了解了一下，因为他今天讲的这些内容呢是书中应该说是都是干货啊。然后呢，他的这个对这个机制啊，这个动力学机制上的这种研究呢，我觉得也是非常的对我们的这个专项来讲呢是非常的有启发。我曾经看过还有一套书啊，是最早先应该是叫邦达楚克的，他们写的叫 Sports Transfer， 叫运动迁移啊，或者叫就是我们讲如何在我们的训练当中将我们的专项训练啊，或者是体能训练，更好的迁移到专项表现上。那他写了这本书，他一共写了3本啊，一共有3集。但是呢，他的这个研究方法其实跟我们这个 Adam 的方法是一样的。我觉得这些教练他们有共同的一个品质是什么？就是深耕在我们的实践的一线啊。那么邦达楚克当时做这本书的时候呢，他是用的方法跟 Adam 是一样的，他就是因为他是投掷教练，所以呢他就把他的队员每天的投掷的所有的数据、所有的表现全部记录下来，然后呢他整理，最终呢来得出一个哪种重量下的投掷对他的专项表现，对他不同阶段的专项表现是最有帮助的。然后呢，他形成了这样一套，给后面教练员这样提供参考的这样一套模型。那 Adam 也是一样的，他刚才也介绍到了，他是用了这个是每一个相当于从进攻和防守2个方面，然后呢，分别选出了他认为最为关键的这个技术，然后呢，对这个关键的这个技术呢又进行了选择了上百位的这个优秀的精英的这个 NBA 的球员的一些视频，然后呢，他再进行这样一个统计，然后来找到他们的相似点，那么把它做成了这样一个我们理想化的这个合理的模型。那所以呢，这种工作量呢很枯燥，也很繁杂，但是呢，一旦它做好之后，它给我们的所有的，无论你是技术教练还是体能教练，其实都有非常非常好的这样一个参考的这样一个价值和意义。所以呢，我觉得今天跟大家这下午的最后一个讲师的跟大家分享这个内容，在我们其他项目当中，我们的青训教练有没有人去做这件事情其实我在今年初的时候，跟我的研究生在讨论选题的时候呢，其实也有这个想法。那我们是选了一个就是我们的跑步机制其实跟这个 Adam 的这个想法是一样的，我是想看一下，就是我们经过常年进行这个专项训练的，或者说早期进行专项化训练的这些青少年的运动员，在不同项目上，他们最大冲刺跑的这个机制，他们有哪些的特征，而这些特征我们是否可以识别出来？哪些特征是合理的，哪些特征是我们讲异常的？那我想拿出这样一个，最终得出这样一个数据之后，也反馈给我们的3线的我们2线的教练员就是他们在组织这样一个专项训练的同时，因为我们知道速度也是非常重要的一个因素如何将这些我们发现的这些问题，能够去在他们的项目当中能够去意识到，然后去解决掉，或者是能够避免一些问题。那我觉得也是从这个角度去思考的。所以我也想，就是我们的教练员，其实我一会儿跟大家分享的内容会涉及到这个问题也是希望我们的，尤其是1线的教练员，很多时候看上去我们的工作很单一，但实际上这些单一的这个过程里会有很多有趣的信息能够去反馈给我们，能够去反馈给我们的同行能够拿出来进行分享和交流的。我们并不是在日复一日的重复一件相同的事情就像我们跟这个车间的工人是不一样的，对吧？我们是在创造，我们是在这个让我们的孩子激发他们的潜能，这个过程是非常有意思的。如果从这个角度去看我们的工作的话，我相信大家可能会更加的去喜爱运动训练会热爱运动训练，会能够在运动训练上面能够有更强的这种动力。刚才呢也看到有一个咱们的这个闵行的教练是吧，提出来了关于这个防守距离和防守体位的这个身体位置的这个问题。因为说实话，我刚才也是第一次在听这个讲师的讲课我也没有完全的吸收。但是呢，从刚才您提到的问题，其实它里面有一个细节讲的，第一步就是 body， 这个 body 实际上就是我们在这个场上可能叫上身体是吧，就是叫主动对抗。那选择主动对抗的这个时机我觉得可能不同项目也会有不同。比如说针对篮球这个项目，如果这是个投手，那你上身体的这一下可能要根据他的位置，他持球的位置来选择。你选择与他之间的这种空间，他如果是在底线位置持球，背身持球，还是说在上线那个面对面的持球，那你的这个 body 怎么去上那这个可能就会有一些差异。那我相信他在这本书中会对这类场景、不同场景下的情况呢，会有一个介绍的。那如果从曲棍球这个角度来，它还涉及到持拍，是吧？它有持杆，那它还涉及到器材之间的这种距离的保持那我觉得可能每个项目也会有很大的差异。所以您的这个问题呢，我觉得这个我们还是那句话，可能要分开来看没有一个唯一的答案，或者是一个最正确的答案，只有一个合理的答案，或者是这个在一个场景下的一个答案。包括我们的这个防守的脚步防守的这个身位